So in some ways, I can relate to a lot of things you're saying.
Okay, Randy, why don't you go ahead and get going?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Randy with the University Bookstore. I'm part of the events team here in Seattle. And tonight, we are very pleased to bring you this, the author of this book, the Bucharest Dossier. The writer is William Maz, and we will meet him in just a moment. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things here. We will have a Q&A chat line underneath, so please, we encourage questions, and I'm sure you'll have a lot because of the topics that we're going to cover. Feel free to write them in there, and we'll try to get to them. Any books that we discuss will be shown in the chat section, and we will be recording this show for future viewings on our YouTube channel. And now I want to introduce our author, William Maz. And William was born in Bucharest, Romania. He emigrated to the US as a child. He is a graduate of Harvard and Mount Sinai Medical School. He studied medicine for 25 years before switching careers. He had a residency in anesthesiology at Yale, and he practiced medicine. And during that time, he developed a passion for writing fiction. He studied writing at Harvard, the New School, and the Writer's Studio in New York City. He is now writing full-time. He divides his time between Pennsylvania and New York City. The Bucharest Dossier is his debut novel. William, welcome. It's great to have you here tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Your book is great. It's really, I read it and it's just fantastic. And I have so many questions for you. I get the feeling you put a lot of yourself into this book. So how much of the Bucharest Dossier is based on your life?
Well, to answer that, we need to talk a little bit about writing. A beginning writer, which I was 20 years ago, I've been writing since I was in high school. And so I don't consider myself a beginning writer, to tell you the truth. This is actually my third novel that I've written, first one to be published. But a beginning writer is told, write what you know. The problem that they have, and I had, was that you think that by writing the events in your life as you experience them, you are telling the truth. And one of the most common comments you get from a student writer when he is being criticized that his story isn't the story is, well, it happened exactly the way I portray it. How can it not be true? And the truth is, life doesn't give you events in a story form. We've all developed over millennia the capability of creating stories in order to understand life. And life is a torrent of unconnected events, at least in our own minds, until we look back and start realizing the connection. So that's, in fact, some scientists believe that we may actually be hardwired into telling stories in order to better understand the world we live in. So the key to writing a story about your life is not to use the entire story, and in fact, not to be loyal to the events in your life. Your only loyalty is to the story you're trying to create, not to the actual events that spawned the story. So you use what you can and you discard what doesn't fit. And so when I say I've put a lot of my own life into this book, it is not in the plot. It is not in that I was part of the revolution. I was not, even though I was there a few months before and a few months after the revolution. I used my knowledge of the society, the culture, the language, the atmosphere of living under a totalitarian regime to imbue the book with, veracity and authenticity. But, you know, there was a little girl named Pusha, that's true, but I never saw her again. So the rest is fiction. I did go to Harvard, but I wasn't approached by the CIA. Or at least I can't tell you even if I were, right? So, so you use what you can from your own life and then develop the story from there.
I'll talk a little bit about the propaganda and lies that you wrote about in Romania in the 1980s. How do you think it might compare with the media of today in the United States?
Oh my God. Propaganda is the meat and potatoes of a totalitarian regime. You have to feed the population the information that you want them to believe. It's happening right now in Russia. The Russian people are only getting state media, which means that they believe, in fact, you know, majority of them apparently believe the lies that they are being told because they have no other source of information. The same thing was happening in the 80s in Romania under the Stalinist tyrant Nicolae Ceausescu, who had a propaganda machine where everything you heard was about the greatness of socialism, how wonderful the factories were, and the cooperative farms and so forth, while outside people were standing in line for food and starving. And so, you know, what do you believe? Do you believe your own eyes, or do you believe the propaganda? And we have that problem today in America. You know, we've had a situation where you're asked to believe your own eyes, or you're asked to believe the propaganda that you're getting. And apparently a lot of people have fallen for the propaganda. So you can see how easy it is.
That's absolutely true. It's unfortunate. I want to go straight to the beginning of the novel here. Your main character is Bill Hefflin, and tell me about him. He starts off. The book kind of starts off. He is a student at Harvard. Is that? And
well, he was. That's a flashback. The book starts with Bill Hefflin being an analyst in the CIA. And he is a unique analyst in that he has his own mole that he is handling. Normally, analysts don't handle moles. I'm sure there must be some exceptions, but their job is usually analytics, sitting behind the desk and putting information together as a puzzle. He has his own mole, however. He codenamed the mole Boris, who is an asset inside the KGB. But he doesn't even know if Boris is a Boris or a Natasha. In fact, he doesn't know the identity of the mole at all. The mole just started sending him intel several years before, and he's simply been the recipient of this intel. Fortunately for him, the intel has been the best the CIA has ever had from inside the KGB, which is making him into a star, without him having done much to earn it, really. And so the book begins with a murder, the murder of his professor at Harvard, Professor Pincus, who was his recruiter into the CIA, and with a message from Boris, his mole, to come to Bucharest to create history. And he is sure that Boris did not use the word create lightly. So he is intrigued, and his masters are intrigued, his boss, and they want to send him to Bucharest to find out what's going on with Boris and to find out what's going on with Romania. And the book takes place in December of 1989, which is an important period because by then the Berlin Wall had fallen, and all the other previous satellite communist states of the Soviet Union had already had their own velvet revolutions, all except one, Romania. So this was the one country left that still held on to communism, because Ceausescu was so hard in his subjugation of his people. So, but Hefflin has a backstory. He has another reason for going to Romania, which is to find a girl he left behind. Hefflin was born in Romania, and he left a girl he loved very much named Pusha, who was whom he left when he was 8 years old, when his parents immigrated from Romania, and whom he has elevated into a mythological creature by now, an idealized love, something that to which no actual person could ever reach, a level of idealism which to him prohibits him from actually having relationships with too many women, because they never actually live up to it. Except for one that he meets at Harvard. Her name is Catherine, and that is his second love of his life. But right now, Hefflin is going to Bucharest in order to meet Boris, which is one plot in the book, which is the spy plot, to find out what Boris wants and what his real mission is, and to find his childhood love, Pusha. Pusha is not a real name. Pusha comes from the Romanian word papusha, which means little doll. And it's a name given to little girls that are cute. And so it kind of blends in with his whole mythological image of her. Is she real? Did she even exist? And, whatever happened to her if she did? So.
One thing I really like about your main character, Bill, he's kind of conflicted, because in his youth, he kind of discarded his heritage, his Romanian Greek heritage, because he wanted to become a full American. But at the same time, doesn't he feel drawn back to his culture, his roots?
Absolutely, and that is the reason why he left the immigrant community in Massachusetts, where he was growing up in America. The immigrant community, and I don't know if it's any different depending on where you come from. You have immigrant communities all over the United States. You have Little Italy, you have Chinatown, you have Astoria in Queens. You have all sorts of immigrant communities where usually first generation, but sometimes more than that, people gather to preserve their language, their traditions. Many times they encourage their kids to marry someone in their own community, to perpetuate the culture that they left behind, even though they left their country because of whatever, either political or economic reasons. They still love their own culture and their own language and so forth. But to Hefflin, he realizes that it is also a way of looking backwards. He wants to look forward. And it's almost like quicksand to him, because if he stays in it too long, he'll never be able to leave. It draws him into it with a warmth that your little nest or your little home draws you in, but you have to leave home. And it is a process of cutting your ties, not only to your parents, but to your culture, in order to come back to it later as you've experienced the arc of life. But if you remain at home, you never get out, you never see the world outside. So that's what he's afraid of. So he wants to break free of the immigrant community, where it is safe to stay and to become a real American. And what could be more real American than joining the CIA?
Well, it's interesting because you talk about Harvard quite a bit in the beginning of the book, and not ever having been a student at Harvard, there's a lot of myths and things that and you kind of explore those, and you talk about at one point in the book you say that Bill always distrusted groups, but he especially distrusted groups of men. And then in Harvard, there's this club in your book called the Fly Club with probably very rich kids. Is the Fly Club real?
The Fly Club is real. There are, I forget how many, probably a dozen men's clubs. Now, in the past few years, they've changed them. They've had to admit women. I don't know if the Fly Club still has all men or not. But during, for the past, I don't know how many years, decades, it's all been men's clubs. And there's another club called the Porcelain Club, which is the most elite, which promises its members that if they haven't made $1 million by the time they're 30, the club will pay that to them. And apparently nobody has had to be paid that until now. At least that's their bragging rights. These clubs have perpetuated their own mythology around them. They are very secret. I mean, Skull and Bones, I think at Yale was what Bush was in or something like that. They both, I don't know about other Ivy League schools, but both Yale and Harvard have these clubs. And they perpetuate the secrecy, and they have whole pedigrees of Rockefellers and Kennedys belonging to them, and they list them all on the walls of the club when you walk in, so you'll know, whose footsteps you're following. So
and the person who was murdered in the beginning, Professor Pincus, is a big kind of I got the impression he's kind of a father figure for Bill, or takes him in, and Professor Pincus is a professor of language, right? He teaches Romanian, and through this circle of the professor and the Fly Club, and Bill kind of gets ensnared into working with the government.
Yes, and with the help of Catherine, who is, even though she's not a member of the Fly Club, hangs around with Fly Club people. And Hefflin falls in love with her, and she seduces him into joining, or at least being open to joining the CIA. And through these spy games, which in which he is asked to follow people around and see whether he likes doing it, how well he does it, how good he is at it, and what kind of information he could get. And he gets paid for it. And being a poor kid, he loves the payment part of it. So he does it, and he learns that he loves doing it. Catherine is a figure that in many ways makes a man out of Hefflin, both sexually and in terms of the espionage abilities, and in terms of just knowledge of the world. Catherine is the daughter of an ambassador, so she's been around the block a few times.
Yeah, and I really like, sometimes I got the impression that you as the author was kind of toying with my mind as the reader. One of the quotes in there was, "Good spycraft is an art like writing a novel." And in fact, Catherine shows up in a car to pick up Bill on a date, and it's described as she appeared in a black sedan, an antique Jaguar from the late 50s, the kind you see in old British spy movies. I kind of think you're trying to get into my head as the reader. Is that true? Or
yes. There are a lot of little tricks that writers use that I don't want to even talk about, but you have to have echoes in your book. And the echoes can appear in many different forms, and you can actually make jokes about the echoes. In the book that I'm writing now, which is a sequel, something happened at the last minute, and the character says something like, why does everything happen at the last minute? Is God a writer of thrillers? So we're kind of trying to make fun of the genre and how everything happens at the last minute because you want to build up tension, but you're also making fun of yourself for doing it that way.
Well, I want to go right to Romania because one of my favorite parts of your writing is how you took me, someone who's never been to Romania or an Eastern Bloc nation, you took me there and showed me kind of a darker underbelly of what it must have been like to live under totalitarian rule. I want to read one sentence that you wrote that I just adore. And Bill is walking through the dark streets of Romania. And it says, the street lamps were unlit, the government's effort to save on fuel. The moon was hidden behind a gray shroud. Even the shadows had decided it was too cold to be outside. That's beautiful. And it took me right there into that scene. He's walking down the alley. And so I want you to tell me about totalitarianism and why you wrote about this. You have said that totalitarianism comes on slowly and like the frog sitting water that is starting to boil, all of a sudden you have all these rights taken away. I don't think I got that line quite right. I'm sorry, but tell me about the totalitarianism that you knew personally, how you incorporated into your book, and how it's affected you, now seeing current events.
Well, totalitarianism has many forms. Communism was only one of them. Right now in Russia, you have totalitarianism without communism, and you've had totalitarianism in other forms with czars and kings and different types of monarchies. But communist totalitarianism was especially evil. At the base of it was control of the population through the secret police, the Securitate, it was called. And the secret police was rumored, and nobody knows, to have had anywhere from 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 20 people of the population, either an agent of the Securitate paid or an informant. And the trick was you never knew who it was. You could be your cousin, could be your classmate, your co-worker, the lady next door. And so whenever there was any talk or planning or attempts at demonstrations or anything like that, the people were quickly arrested and never heard from again. Ceausescu supposedly had over 100,000 people in psychiatric wards simply for political reasons. Other people were put in jails. Other people were simply demoted from their jobs if their issues were not serious. And others were forced to become informants or be put in jail for what another informant informed on them for. To the point where informants often made up things about the people they were supposed to inform on in order to save their own lives and their own families. So a lot of people went to jail for no reason at all. And this has been documented by many in the world. So the Securitate was all-powerful, pervasive. There were microphones everywhere. Ashtrays in a restaurant had microphones. All the phones in a hotel had microphones. All the personnel in a hotel were Securitate workers, from the waiters to the cleaning ladies. All the telephones that came from the factory came with a microphone inside of them, so they could listen to not only your conversation on the phone, but everything that went on in the room. So that when you came home, when you came to somebody's house, you would see this telephone wire going from the wall into a drawer or a closet, so that it would muffle the microphone in the phone. So through these means, there was a pervasive terror of the Securitate and no resistance. There were no Vaclav Havels, no Lech Walesas, no heroes, because they were all in jails or in psychiatric wards.
So you mixed a lot of real history in with your book, and a lot of history I wasn't that intimately aware of, and so I really enjoyed reading about the revolution.
Yeah.
Which I was amazed that I actually didn't know about the details and how Ceausescu and his wife were rounded up, and it was not a pretty sight. And there was so looking at YouTube, it was pretty brutal what happened, as history. And you wrote that factual data into the novel, leading up to it. And I thought that was really, really extraordinary. How much of that is of your book is accurate, is true?
Yeah. It's all true to the best of my ability, except for where there are gaps in history, in which I take poetic license to provide my own interpretation. So the events leading up to the revolution are true. The revolution started in a city called Timișoara, which is near the Hungarian border in Transylvania. There was a priest named Laszlo Tokes, who was a known anti-communist, and the Securitate wanted to move him to the countryside so he wouldn't have any influence. And the people started gathering around his house to prevent him from being moved. And that's how it all started. And as the days grew, as the days went by, the crowd grew to the point where there were like 100,000 people gathered around his house and through the streets. And at one point, somebody started shooting. And people started pointing to snipers on the rooftops in civilian clothes. And the funny thing was that snipers were shooting both at the people who started falling in droves and at the soldiers who were also being wounded. So at that point, the soldiers panicked and they started shooting indiscriminately into the crowd. Some of them even shot into other soldiers, thinking that there was a part of the soldiers that were mutinying. And so there was a whole mayhem where anywhere from 600 to 1,000 people died over the course of a couple of days. The revolution spread then to other cities, to Bucharest. To make a long story short, because it's all historical, you can, like you said, you can see it on YouTube and you can read about it. Ceausescu tried to escape with a helicopter from the top of the Central Committee building. He was eventually caught in a town called Târgoviște. A 45-minute trial was performed, and it was a performance, a pretty amateurish one, in fact. And then they were brought in the back against the wall and executed, shot. That was how the reign of terror of Ceausescu ended. The question that they still ask today, if you go to Romania, they're still talking about it on television and in private homes, is, was this a real revolution? Or was it a coup? And if it was a coup, who was involved? Because a lot of strange things happen in it, which I go into the book, including the successor to Ceausescu, a guy named Iliescu, who was a classmate of Gorbachev, who was the head of Russia at the time. And so some of the thinking was that maybe Gorbachev had a say in this. But that doesn't make sense to me, and this is where history does not provide an answer yet. And I provide my own. theory about it.
What kind of research did you do on spycraft? Throughout the book, there's kind of an underlying mantra amongst the spies, and that's spies don't kill spies. Is that true? Because, that's not always true in the book, is it? I mean,
it's not always true, but it's an old mantra that has exceptions like every rule. So, and it's also an old-fashioned one. And because during this time, things are also changing, and you begin to have the whole Al-Qaeda situation, and that whole thing changed all the rules. But in the old days, spies were basically, they knew each other. They went drinking together, and you can see it in some of the movies that we see today, where American and Russian spies know each other. They exchange information sometimes in order to help their governments, keep the peace and so forth. They don't kill each other because there's no reason for it. And so they are simply handlers of information that they get from their sources in each other's countries. And so the rule was basically that, there's no point, because if you start killing the other guy's spies, then they're going to kill yours, and there's going to be a massacre. So there's basically an understanding, okay, we're all spying on each other, as long as we keep it gentlemanly, but there are exceptions, and one of the exceptions I talk about in the book, where we won't talk about it here, but it's one of the reasons that Hefflin is called to Bucharest.
Yeah, and actually, there are all these. I have a whole new understanding, I guess, of Kent cigarettes, because whenever Bill needs something or wants a favor from a citizen, he's kind of just pulls out a couple packs.
Oh, that is totally true. Every time I went to Romania, I brought in several cartons of Kents, and in fact, I have a scene in there which really happened. In I forget when it was, early 80s. I went into the airport. No, it was actually late 70s. I went to the airport and for my passport check, and the guy behind the grating was a military guy, young guy, like in his 20s. And he just looks at me insolently and he says, "Don't you have anything for me?" in Romanian. At first, I tried to pretend I didn't understand Romanian, But then, the lady in back of me hits me on the shoulder and hands me a pack of Kents. And she just motions to give it to him. So I give it to him, and he throws it into this open sack. Well, that must have had about 100 packs in there of Kents. And what I didn't know was that first time that I went there was that Kents had become an alternate source of currency in Romania. Now, there's a historical reason for it. Kent was the first company that introduced cigarettes, started selling cigarettes into communist Romania in the 50s, I think it was, whenever it was. So the Kents became the favorite American cigarette. And, there was contraband in Kents, and there were tourists who brought in Kents, and you can get a lot for a Kent. You can get a dinner for a pack of Kents or two. You can get, like I explained in the book, a woman for the night for a couple of packs of Kents. You can get a lot, a taxi driver all day for a pack of Kents. So it was worth a lot more than the leu, the lion, was that the local currency is called.
Another fun little object, I guess, that's throughout your book are the little dacias, the little black cars, and you just knew when you saw one of those cars, it was a harbinger for something probably not good.
The dacias were an old Renault that the French government built a factory in Romania to build, and I don't have the date right now, but it was decades before, and the Romanians had never changed the model, never changed anything, and they were badly made. Within the first month, they would break down, and they only came with either white or black colors. And you have to understand about Romania and cars. There weren't very many. And the reason is there was no way to buy a car or get a loan for a car. You had to amass the money that it took to buy the whole car first. And then you went to the manager of the car company, everything was state owned, and you put your name on a list. It normally took you 5 years to get delivery of the car after you've paid for the whole thing. If you bribed the man, you went higher and higher on the list. The shortest time I ever heard of was 1 year. But everything was based on bribes under communism. And this is all over communism, not just in Romania, in Russia, Czechoslovakia, everywhere. Everything was based on bribes. You wanted, people stood in line for meat or bread, excuse me. But if you didn't want to stand in line, you bribed the butcher to save you a slab of beef, or you bribed the grocer to save you a dozen eggs. You want to go to a doctor, you have to bring him something even to let you in the door. A chicken, a dozen eggs, a loaf of bread. If you needed an operation, you'd better have a grandmother with jewelry from the old days. Otherwise, you don't have it. And the corruption went all the way to the top. Most of the higher echelon people had offshore numbered accounts in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg, which they never found, by the way, including Ceausescu's money, which is another part of the book that I talk about. I only fill in the blanks that history doesn't answer in the book. Everything else is factual.
So I want to touch on a theme that you brought up in standing in line, and in your book, there's a scene where I think Bill confronts or talks to a man who's been standing in line for hours just for a pair of shoes that don't even fit.
Right.
And the man explains, well, you just don't understand how this operates. We all get all these shoes, and then we just barter later and trade them back and forth. So what do you think living under these conditions does to the people, the souls of the people? For me, I got to tell you, for me, there's no doubt in my mind these things happened, but I have a hard time. I can visualize it, but can I really feel it? Because I've never had to live that way. So how? I guess my question is, when you're living in those conditions, do you just accept it as this is the way it is and this is how it is for everybody, or how do people feel?
Or what? That's the point. There is no or. You accept it, and you learn to accept it from a young age. And it's a weight and a fatigue that brings everyone down to a level of almost like you're walking in your sleep. There is no, children are happy because they don't know what's going on. But once you start to grow up and you realize the kind of world you live in, there's very little happiness in that environment. There is a drudgery, I think the way I would describe it, where every day you have to stand in line for food. And whatever you can barter. People stood in line without knowing what they're standing in line for. It didn't matter. They would buy it anyway and then barter to something that they needed. The whole idea of being spied upon, and I've read literature of how, this is literature by scholars where they describe how meticulous the Securitate was in creating these dossiers, these files on all their citizens, or many of their citizens, I should say. I'm sure whenever I visited, there was a file on me. There must have been a file on my relatives because I went and stayed with them. Where I went, they describe, not with me because I haven't seen, but I've seen other ones where they describe what trolley you took, what time you took the trolley, what streets you visited, which stores you went into, how many times you used the phone, public phone. I mean, meticulous things in your dossier for all their people that they had interest in. So you live with the idea that you're always being observed. You live with the idea that there's no reason to work hard because you can't get anything better anyway. This is it. As a result, people left work around noontime to stand in line to get some food. The managers didn't care because they had to stand in line too. People drank a lot, began the day with Zuika, which is this plum brandy that they made at home. Bus drivers, drunk by noontime. I was on a bus where at a stop sign, the bus driver slumped over his steering wheel and a bottle of Zuika rolled out of his pocket. Drunkenness was pervasive. And so depression, I think, is what it was, just a generalized depression and hopelessness.
Wow, because from looking at it from a typical American viewpoint, if we had to stand in line an hour for a dozen eggs, we'd probably get really angry and
4 or 5 hours, never mind 1 hour. And sometimes the truck didn't arrive. It was only a rumor, so you stood in line for nothing. I mean, that's
so it was
daily
just
activity.
it was just a feeling of loss and
Yeah.
hopelessness that it's not going to get any better. Go home and have a drink.
That's it. And people had a lot of affairs. That's the other one. That's the other thing that happened. AIDS was rampant, and they had this French. The Romanians have been Francophiles. Loved the French for centuries. There's a whole history with the French, and so a lot of the culture is French-like, and so affairs were common. In fact, lovers became part of the family. Everybody knew about it. Nobody talked about it. That kind of environment.
How did religion, you mentioned religion a few times in your book, how did religion fit into this, the situation that you're describing?
Religion was not crushed. It was still allowed, but it was not encouraged, and it was frowned upon. And yet there were still churches and there were still priests, but the priests were all Securitate informants. In fact, the patriarch, the head of the Romanian Orthodox Church, was a big Ceausescu fan. And until he was actually shot, he was preaching how great Ceausescu was and what a great thing he did in Timișoara in trying to put down the revolt. So yeah, they were all paid.
I'd like to bring up just a quote from your book when one of your characters says, the worst mistake Marx ever made was to reject religion. Yes, I know it's the opiate of the masses and all that, but communism is at its core a Christian belief system. Each man labors according to his means and receives according to his needs, all for the common good. What can be more Christian than that? The problem is that man is not like that. Communism failed for the same reason religion is failing. Boris settled back in his chair and poured another drink. We are all fallen angels, my friend. We all try to get the better of our neighbor. That is reality. Is this, communism is at its core a Christian belief system?
Well, the reason communism was something that attracted a lot of Americans during the 50s, and there were all those trials, the McCarthy hearings and everything else, is because people read parts of Marx and they thought they knew what communism was about. And Marxism and communism, the way it was practiced, had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Marx, in fact, despised central government, despised authoritarianism. And the reason he despised religion is because he thought that because most religions promise you a paradise afterward and tell you to simply pray if you can't change the world here, he thought that that was an opiate because in fact, you should fight to change the world here as we find it and not wait until you die to find paradise. So that's why he called it the opiate of the masses. But basically his idea was we all live for the common good, for the betterment of the commune, and we should all work as hard as we can for the common good and take only what we need for a comfortable life, but no more, you know. And so that is a basic religious concept, except that you can't, I mean, people don't function that way. They don't think that way. In communal farms, they never worked. The production plummeted once they became cooperatives. It was nobody's responsibility to work. So the production, disappeared. Anyway.
Throughout the book, there's occasional comparisons of democracy to communism, and I'd like to just bring up a quick passage. Bill, I think, he's wondering if this was the natural order of things. Both capitalism and communism had evolved into the basically similar systems. Individual struggle for survival. Damn your neighbor. It was just that capitalism had been more successful, allowing more scraps to fall off the table down to the poor. Trickle-down economics, Reagan had called it. So kind of interesting how you drop, you talk about communism and capitalism, or your characters do, not you, but your characters kind of wonder, which system is better. And I think there's a kind of a prevailing thought that here clearly that capitalism has been more successful.
Capitalism, and I point throughout the whole book through the voice of Boris, is successful because it latches itself to the natural competitiveness of the human spirit. I mean, we are the most aggressive and competitive species on the planet. It's not an accident that we've become the dominant species. It's not just our intelligence, it's our competitiveness. And so the whole idea of capitalism is to harness that competitiveness and to use it for the common good, but it leaves huge gaps. My point there was that there were huge gaps in the communist system too. The nomenclatura, the high class of the communist regime, lived like princes with offshore accounts and vacations on the Riviera, while the rest of the people starved. And so there wasn't a heck of a lot of difference, even though they preached otherwise.
One of the things I really like is your a lot of, or some of your book certainly involves the theater. And in fact, the morsel that you throw out to the masses is the government also kind of supports the theater. I think they keep the ticket prices low. They want people to go to the theater. And in it, there are actors. In fact, Bill has a cousin who's a famous actress there. So much of the maybe the middle book part of your book involves the actors and a lot of Chekhov at the Odeon Theater. And so one of the actors says, "Our life is on stage, the rest is just a nightmare." And these actors are living probably a lot better than the average person out there working.
Yeah.
And one of the lines, one of the actors says, "We all live under life's restrictions. You do too, albeit different ones than mine. You think you are free because you vote. You can go anywhere you please. You can say anything you want. but your freedom is illusory. You cannot go anywhere unless you have the money to do so. You have a vote, but the millionaire who contributes to his candidate can pick up the phone and call him whenever he wants for a favor. I think this is some of the gaps that you were just mentioning, that this actor is talking about. You can't go anywhere you want unless you have the money to do so.
That's right. And you can't have your voice heard unless you have a megaphone or a lot of money to pick up the phone and call your senator. And his whole point was, he was comparing it to acting. And his whole point was that the words on the page, some people think are restrictive for the actor, because the actor has to follow the words. He can't just express himself the way he wants to. The writer has already put the words in his mouth. And this actor, who was a real actor, who told me this, his real name was Radu Beligan. He was like the Laurence Olivier of Romania. He said, look, the words on the page are not, if you know how to use them, are not a restriction. They are barriers within which you can then use your creativity in order to express and feel those words and make the audience also feel them. It says the same way that we live in this country, we live between barriers. And you can be destroyed by them, or you can learn to live within them, like I have. And he had actually become a member of the Politburo in order to get along.
And also throughout the book, the Romanian language or language in general is very important to the characters. The saving grace was the language. For him, Bill, it was suffused with personal memories and collective allusions, with facial expressions and hand gestures, with turns of a phrase that captured just the right meaning or emotion, often in ways inexpressible in English. He loved to bathe in it, to let it awaken those parts of his mind long dormant and hidden.
Oh, absolutely. And anyone who knows more than one language from a young age knows what I'm talking about. I mean, I speak 3 languages fluently. I learned 3 of them by the time I was 8. Greek, Romanian, and English. And each language has its own culture, its own way of thinking, its own way of expressing anything from love to just the way it describes the weather or anything else. And there are ways of speaking where I use all 3 languages in one sentence with somebody that speaks them in order to fully express what I want to mean. Language also carries with it memories, expressions. Like, for instance, in Romanian, if you want to say no, you go like this, you raise your chin and do a clicking of the, that comes to you as you speak Romanian. If you've done it since childhood, those expressions come with the language. My heart still warms, even though I haven't been, I don't speak Romanian anymore around here, but whenever I hear it in a taxi cab, for instance, when I'm in the city, it warms up when I hear the language and I have those memories. So I'm sure a lot of immigrants have the same feeling.
In your book, you also use, there's a lot of mysticism in Tanti Bobo, who's kind of an older woman who kind of is a seer. Does that relate to your experiences, your childhood, or is there?
Yes, she's a gypsy. Gypsies the word gypsy comes from the Greek Egyptos, which means Egyptian, but that's because in the Middle Ages, they thought the gypsies came from Egypt. They actually come from Northern India. So, but the name stuck. Their name that they prefer is Roma, R-O-M-A. And the gypsies are a hated group all over Eastern Europe. They are blamed for everything. They are nomadic. Some of them, at least they were, until the communists tried to settle them. They are so derided that they're not given a proper education. They live in slums, the whole thing. And so whenever there's a COVID or something like that, they blame it on the gypsies. And we've seen this in countries and in history all over the world. The Nazis blamed both Jews and gypsies. He tried to annihilate both of them. Right now in America, we have this whole thing, we're blaming everything on immigrants coming from the South. So in every totalitarian government, you need someone to blame. And so they try to choose a minority to do so. And in Romania, it's the gypsy.
Tell me a little bit about the Atene Palace Hotel, because a lot of the, maybe not action, but a lot of the subtleties, a lot of the characters get gathered there, and a lot of information kind of goes back and forth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The Atene Palace Hotel is a famous hotel in Romania. It was a beautiful hotel. It still exists, but it's been modernized and therefore ruined. But it was during the interwar years, and especially before the Second World War, it was the place to be in Bucharest. It was where all the generals, the Nazi generals went. It was where all the Romanian generals went. It's where all the spies went. And there was a book actually called the Atene Palace, written by a correspondent who described all the things that went on in the bar and the dining room of the hotel. People spread rumors, spread intelligence, met their contacts and whatever, had affairs in the hotel. And that is where the center of action was for Romania, for Bucharest, during the pre-war years, pre-World War II. So I wanted to bring that back and describe how it was, and maybe try to recreate a more modern version of it.
Well, you did a magnificent job. And I think we only have about 2 minutes left. There's so much more that I wish I could talk to you about. Really fascinating book. It's the Bucharest Dossier by William Maz. We thank you very much for joining us tonight, William. And I want to thank everybody who's watching on our YouTube and watching tonight. Thank you so much.
It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Good night, everyone. And please join us again soon.